The letter from the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association landed on my doorstep like an IED, unexpected, threatening, and capable of destroying everything I'd built. Just like in Fallujah, they wanted to take away what kept me alive. Only this time, it wasn't my weapon. It was my dog's. My name is Marcus Reeves. 3 tours in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq, and 12 confirmed bomb disposals later, I thought I'd seen the worst humanity had to offer. I was wrong. The worst wasn't in the desert halfway across the world. It was right here in suburban America, wearing khakis and clutching property value spreadsheets. It started 8 months ago when I woke up screaming for the 3rd time that week. My hands were shaking so badly I couldn't even hold my coffee mug. The nightmares wouldn't stop. The red wire, the blue wire, the ticking clock. The faces of the men and women I couldn't save. My VA-appointed therapist had suggested getting a service dog. Animals can sense when you're about to have an episode, she'd said. They can interrupt the pattern. So I got Zeus, a retired military German shepherd who'd lost his handler to an IED in Kandahar. We were 2 broken soldiers trying to put ourselves back together. Within weeks, my panic attacks decreased by half. I could sleep through most nights. Zeus would press his weight against me when I started to spiral, licking my hand until I came back to the present. Then I started thinking about all the other service dogs out there. The ones who'd lost their handlers or were too old or injured to continue active duty. What happened to them? The answer was ugly. Many were euthanized if they couldn't be rehomed quickly. These dogs had saved countless lives, detected explosives that would have killed entire squads, and provided crucial intelligence. They deserved better than a cold table and a lethal injection. My property in Oak Ridge was modest, but it sat on 2 acres at the edge of the subdivision. I built kennels, installed proper fencing, and converted my garage into a rehabilitation space. Within 3 months, I had 6 former military working dogs besides Zeus. By 6 months, I had 11. These weren't ordinary pets. Each had been rigorously trained by the military. They were disciplined, quiet, and struggling with their own versions of PTSD. Some flinched at loud noises. Others became agitated around certain smells. All of them needed someone who understood. Word spread through veteran networks. Handlers who couldn't keep their partners after discharge would contact me. Military dog trainers connected me with canines too traumatized to continue service. We became a sanctuary. Second tour, I called it. A place where service ended with dignity, not disposal. Everything was running smoothly until Karen Holbrook moved in 4 houses down. Mr. Reeves, it has come to our attention that you are operating an unauthorized kennel business in violation of Oak Ridge Homeowners Association bylaws, specifically Section 7.2 regarding residential-only usage and Section 9.4 limiting households to 2 domestic pets. The letter was signed by Theodore Winfield, HOA president, but I knew whose manicured hand was really behind it. I'd met Karen at the neighborhood barbecue last month. Her pearl earrings bobbed as she interrogated me about all those dogs she'd seen on my property. When I explained what second tour was, her smile tightened. How noble, she'd said, glancing pointedly at the scar running down my cheek. But surely there are more appropriate locations for such an enterprise. The barking must be dreadful. They don't bark much, ma'am, I'd replied. They're military trained. Discipline is in their blood. Still, she'd insisted, property values are a concern for all of us, and allergies. Did you know my daughter is severely allergic? I later learned that Karen's daughter was away at college in California and hadn't set foot in Oak Ridge in years. The letter continued. You have 30 days to remedy this violation or face an initial fine of $100 per day, per animal exceeding the limit. With 11 dogs, that would amount to $900 daily after the grace period. I was surviving on my military pension and disability payments. I couldn't afford that. Not even close. I crumpled the letter in my fist, feeling my heart rate spike. Zeus immediately pressed against my leg, sensing the change. Through the window, I could see Karen walking her tiny Pomeranian, deliberately slowing as she passed my house. This was war. And if there's one thing a veteran knows, it's that you don't win wars alone. My first ally was unexpected. Sasha Petrov lived across the street, a quiet woman who rarely engaged with neighbors beyond a polite nod. I'd noticed her watching the two dogs sometimes when I exercised them in the yard, but she'd never approached. Until now. I received same letter, she said, the morning after the HOA notice arrived. Her Russian accent was still thick despite years in America. About my chickens. 3 chickens only, but Karen, she complains about smell. There is no smell. She never even comes to my yard. Sasha, it turned out, was a former software engineer who now worked remotely. More importantly, she knew how to research. HOA bylaws are public record, she explained as we sat at my kitchen table. And minutes from meetings. I find interesting things. Those interesting things included the fact that Theodore Winfield had approved an extension to his own deck that violated setback requirements, and Karen Holbrook had installed unapproved landscaping last spring. The rules, it seemed, bent for some, but remained rigid for others. By the end of the week, we had 5 more neighbors with similar stories. Miguel Sanchez had been fined for his work truck parked in his driveway overnight, despite working emergency plumbing repairs. Elderly Mrs. Whitaker had received warnings about her unsightly wheelchair ramp, which she'd installed after her hip replacement. The Foster family had been threatened over their autistic son's therapeutic trampoline. We gathered in my living room on Saturday, surrounded by the calm presence of my canine charges. Zeus rested his head on Miguel's knee, somehow sensing the plumber's recent back injury. Aries, a chocolate lab who'd survived 3 roadside bombs, sat alertly by Mrs. Whitaker's side. They behave better than most people, Mrs. Whitaker observed, patting Aries gently. That's the point, I said. These aren't just pets. They've served our country, saved lives. Now they're helping veterans heal. Some of these dogs suffered injuries in the line of duty. I gestured to Apollo, a Belgian Malinois missing his left front leg after a firefight in Helmand Province. What the HOA is doing isn't just unfair, it's disrespectful to their service. But what can we do? Miguel asked. The HOA has the legal right to enforce these rules. We all signed the agreements when we bought our homes. That's when Sasha smiled. Maybe yes, maybe no. I make some calls. There is someone you should meet. James Connor was the antithesis of what I expected in a lawyer. No suit, no slick haircut, no leather briefcase. Instead, he showed up in worn jeans, a faded Marines t-shirt, and a prosthetic leg that he didn't bother to conceal. Fallujah, 2004, he said, catching my glance at the prosthetic. Stepped on something I shouldn't have. You? EOD, I replied. Bomb disposal, same places, different jobs. He nodded, understanding immediately. So I hear you've got yourself an HOA problem, and some 4-legged veterans needing protection. We walked through the facility I'd built, and James watched as the dogs went through their daily routines. He observed how Apollo, despite his missing leg, still performed perimeter checks with military precision. How Athena, a German shepherd who'd been trapped in rubble for 3 days after an explosion, now helped me demonstrate calm behavior for dogs with more severe trauma. This isn't a kennel, James said finally. This is rehabilitation, therapy, and that changes everything. Back inside, he spread out papers across my dining table. There are 3 things working in your favor, he explained. First, the Fair Housing Act protects service animals, and these qualify even if they're not directly servicing you. Second, the PACT Act passed last year includes provisions for the welfare of retired military working dogs. And third, he grinned, your HOA is sloppy with its own procedures. He pointed to a clause in the bylaws. Changes to animal restrictions require a 2/3 majority vote from all homeowners, not just board members. I've reviewed the meeting minutes for the past 5 years. They never held such a vote when they reduced the pet limit from 3 to 2 animals last year. Hope flickered in my chest. So what do? We could fight them on procedural grounds, but that's just a temporary fix. They'd correct their mistake and come after you again. James leaned back. No, we need a more permanent solution. We need to change the rules altogether. The next month was a blur of activity. James helped me file for official recognition as a rehabilitation facility for service animals, which would exempt Second Tour from being classified as a kennel business. Sasha built a website documenting each dog's military service and their ongoing journey. But our masterstroke came from an unlikely source. Mrs. Whitaker's grandson, a journalism student at the State University, wrote an article about Second Tour that got picked up by the local paper. Soon a regional TV station wanted to do a feature. The day the TV crew arrived, I made sure everything was immaculate. The dogs performed their training demonstrations flawlessly, showing off their discipline and the critical skills that had saved so many lives overseas. And what about the neighbors, the reporter asked. Any complaints about noise or disturbances? Why don't you ask them yourself? I gestured to where Sasha, Miguel, Mrs. Whitaker, and a dozen other neighbors stood, ready with testimonials about how Second Tour had actually improved the neighborhood. The reporter seemed impressed, but I couldn't help noticing Karen Holbrook, watching from the edge of the gathering, her face pinched with displeasure. This battle was far from over. The feature aired on a Thursday evening. By Friday morning, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. Veterans organizations, animal welfare groups, and ordinary citizens wanted to know how they could help. Donations flooded the website Sasha had created. Local businesses offered supplies and support. More crucially, homeowners within Oak Ridge who'd never spoken to me before were suddenly introducing themselves, expressing support, sharing their own stories of HOA overreach. The HOA board called an emergency meeting for the following Tuesday. They didn't invite me, but James had anticipated this move. They're going to try to rush through a more specific prohibition, he warned. We need to be ready. We spent the weekend gathering signatures for our counter-proposal, an amendment to the HOA bylaws that would create a specific exemption for rehabilitation facilities for service animals, particularly those with military backgrounds. Tuesday evening arrived, and the Oak Ridge Community Center was packed beyond capacity. Board President Theodore Winfield looked uncomfortable as he called the meeting to order, eyeing the unusual crowd with suspicion. We have a single agenda item tonight, he announced. A proposed amendment to clarify the pet restrictions in light of recent situations. Karen Holbrook stood, clutching a folder of papers. As the chair of the Community Standards Committee, I've drafted language that would explicitly prohibit the operation of animal kennels, shelters, or similar facilities, regardless of their claimed purpose. She emphasized claimed with obvious disdain. This will protect our property values and community character from inappropriate. Point of order. James Connor rose from his seat near the back. Despite his casual attire, his voice carried the authority of the courtroom. Before the board considers new restrictions, there's the matter of the existing pet limit reduction that was implemented without the required 2/3 homeowner vote last year. Murmurs spread through the room. Theodore Winfield shifted uncomfortably. And you are? James Connor, attorney representing Marcus Reeves and Second Tour Rehabilitation Facility. He moved to the front of the room. I've reviewed all HOA proceedings for the past 5 years. The vote to reduce the pet limit from 3 to 2 animals was conducted with only board members present, in direct violation of your own bylaws. Article 4, Section 3. The murmurs grew louder. Theodore tried to regain control. This is an inappropriate forum to raise such concerns. If Mr. Reeves wishes to dispute his violation, there's a formal appeals process. I'm not disputing the violation, I said, standing up. I'm challenging the legitimacy of the rule itself. James distributed copies of our counter-proposal to each board member. We have signatures from 157 Oak Ridge homeowners, well over the 2/3 majority required, supporting this amendment, to create an exemption for service animal rehabilitation facilities with proper certification. Karen Holbrook's face flushed crimson. This is absurd. You can't just change the rules because you don't like them. Actually, James replied calmly, that's exactly how democratic governance works. And since proper procedure wasn't followed for the pet limit reduction, we're also requesting that any fines or violations based on that invalid rule be immediately rescinded. The room erupted in applause. Theodore Winfield pounded his gavel, trying desperately to restore order. This is Irregular, he sputtered. We need time to review these documents. Consult our own legal counsel. Of course, James agreed. In the meantime, since the legitimacy of the rule is in question, no enforcement actions should be taken against Second Tour or any other residents with more than 2 pets. Theodore looked like he wanted to object, but seemed to realize he was outmaneuvered. We'll take it under advisement. It wasn't a victory yet, but it was a reprieve. As the meeting adjourned, neighbors I barely knew came up to shake my hand, pat my back, offer encouragement. For the first time since leaving the military, I felt part of something larger than myself again. Karen Holbrook wasn't finished. 2 days after the meeting, a county animal control officer showed up at my door, citing anonymous complaints about dangerous animals and unsanitary conditions. The inspection, however, backfired spectacularly. The officer, a former Army Ranger, himself, was impressed by the facility and the dog's behavior. He left with brochures about Second Tour and a promise to refer veterans he knew who might benefit from our program. Next came code enforcement, investigating claims of unauthorized construction. They found all my permits in order. James had made sure of that. The pressure continued, but so did our momentum. A local construction company offered to build proper kennels and a training area at cost. A veterinary clinic provided free checkups and care for all the dogs. The regional TV station did a follow-up story, focusing on the HOA conflict and the community's response. Public opinion was solidly in our favor, but Karen and Theodore still controlled the HOA board. They delayed voting on our amendment, cited procedural concerns, and made increasingly technical arguments about zoning and residential definitions. They're stalling, James observed after yet another inconclusive board meeting, hoping we'll lose steam or make a mistake. So what's our next move? I asked. He smiled grimly. Nuclear option. We force a recall election of the entire board. The recall petition spread through Oak Ridge like wildfire. Years of accumulated resentment against the HOA's petty enforcement and selective rule application fueled its momentum. Within 2 weeks, we had signatures from over 75% of homeowners. The day we submitted the petition, Theodore Winfield called an emergency session of the board to finally vote on our amendment. Suddenly, they were eager to appear reasonable, to show they were listening to community concerns. Too late. We declined to withdraw the recall petition. The amendment vote was merely a tactical retreat. We wanted strategic victory. The recall election was scheduled for a month later. During that time, Second Tour held an open house every weekend. Neighbors who had never visited could see firsthand what we were doing. Veterans brought their families to meet the dogs that had served alongside them in combat zones. Apollo, with his 3-legged determination, became something of a local celebrity. Children asked to pet him, and he would sit patiently, his military bearing softened by gentle eyes. Athena demonstrated how she could detect signs of anxiety and provide calming pressure. Zeus showed how he could guide a disoriented person to safety. These weren't just dogs. They were heroes continuing their service in a different way. And the community began to see them that way too. Election day arrived. The community center was transformed into a polling station, with volunteers checking names against the homeowner roster. Theodore and Karen had mounted a desperate campaign focusing on property values and appropriate uses for residential areas, but their arguments felt hollow against the reality of what Second Tour represented. The votes were counted that evening. The result was decisive. All 5 board members recalled to be replaced by a new slate that included Miguel Sanchez, Sasha Petrov, and 3 other neighbors who supported our cause. Karen Holbrook stormed out before the final tally was announced. Theodore Winfield stayed, his face grim but resigned. You know, he said to me as people celebrated around us, I never had anything against your dogs personally. I was just trying to follow the rules. That's the problem, I replied. Sometimes, the rules need to follow what's right, not the other way around. 6 months later, Second Tour had expanded to include a visiting program, where our rehabilitated service dogs visited the local VA hospital, bringing comfort to veterans still struggling with their own wounds, both visible and hidden. Our amendment had passed unanimously under the new board, creating not just an exemption for second tour, but a framework for other service-oriented activities within the community. Property values hadn't plummeted. In fact, homes in Oak Ridge were now marketed as part of a veteran-friendly community with unique amenities. Karen Holbrook put her house up for sale 3 weeks after the election. The new owners, coincidentally, were a young couple, the husband a Marine recently returned from overseas. They had a service dog of their own, a Springer Spaniel named Liberty, who had detected explosives in Syria. Today, as I watch Apollo teaching their children how to give proper commands, I think about the strange battlefield I found myself fighting on after returning home. Not sand and mountains, but suburban streets and community centers. Not against insurgents, but against indifference and bureaucracy. Different battlefield, same mission, protecting those who served, ensuring no one gets left behind. Through the window, I can see Zeus patrolling the perimeter of our property, not because he needs to, but because old habits die hard. I understand completely. We're both still on duty in our way. The war might be over for us, but the service never really ends. It just finds a new mission, a new purpose. And sometimes, that purpose is right in your own backyard. I reach for my phone as it buzzes with a text message. Another retired military dog needing placement. Another chance to continue the mission. Roger that, I reply. Send them home to us. Home. That's what second tour has become. Not just for the dogs, but for me. A place where service continues. Wounds heal and battles worth fighting are won one day at a time. I whistle for Zeus. Time for our evening rounds, checking on each of our charges. The mission continues, and this time, we have the whole neighborhood watching our 6.